Are you a thoughtful leader? Maybe you are. Maybe you think you are. Let's find out. I'm Mindy Gibbins-Klein. I'm author of The Thoughtful Leader and host of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. Thoughtful leadership is all about thought leadership that goes above and beyond. Thought leadership that is truly new and original, exciting, disruptive, maybe even groundbreaking. Because let's face it, we need to raise the bar. My guests and I are absolutely obsessed with finding truly original thought leadership, and I'm going to bring you so many exciting ideas and opportunities, things for you to think about, and chances for you to push your thinking that you'll be very glad you tuned in. So thanks so much for checking out Thoughtful Leadership and the Thoughtful Leader podcast. I look forward to connecting with you very, very soon. Welcome to the show. My guest today is the amazing thoughtful leader, Victoria Wilson. She has been recommended to me, and I always love it when that happens because that means other people are endorsing and putting their best contacts forward. So hopefully you will also become one of Victoria's fans today. And welcome, Victoria.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a delight to have you here on the show. So this is very interesting because so many of my guests are based in Europe. We are branching out. We are getting guests from different places. And you live where I'm from in North America. So tell us where you are and what you're up to in the world.
Right. So I am in Raleigh, North Carolina. That is a little bit south of Washington, D.C. And before that, I had actually spent over 20 years living in Northern California. So I'm a recent transplant to this area. But before that, I actually was born and raised in Japan. So I am very much aware of the effect that different cultures and cultural influences have in our not only our day-to-day life, but our professional lives as well.
And you, what age were you when you left Japan?
I was 18. So I came to the university to study in the United States. And my goodness, it was quite a culture shock for me, even though I spoke English. In fact, I speak English with a Midwestern accent, as they say. I felt culturally I was just a very different person. And so it took me a few years for me to really understand the norms and really how society worked here.
Well, I grew up in the US, but when I was 16, I went to Argentina for a full year, and I challenged myself not to speak any English during that year. I was living with a family, and I had to complete my high school studies, and I had already studied Spanish for 9 years at that point. So I feel I did really well. I never thought about the culture shock, and I didn't have so much culture shock going, funny enough, because I was immersed in it, excited. When I went back to the US, I really felt it. And I was grieving for the experience and the family I left, and I didn't know when I'd get back. I was so surprised. Is that normal?
Absolutely. In fact, there's a phrase called reverse culture shock, right? So when you do return to the country of your origin, and sometimes that can be even more of a jarring experience because you left and experience something different and new. And then you're coming back to perhaps a society or a culture that may not have shifted too much, right? And so and I love the word that you used, grieving in that process, right? Because you feel like it is a loss of yourself, of your own identity at a certain point.
Well, I think we use the word culture very carelessly in our society. So people talk about the company culture, but that's actually really relevant as well. I was just, it's fascinating, this topic, because I'll let you talk about what you want, but you've now made me think about when I left the corporate world and I became self-employed. That was a huge culture shock. And I was an accidental entrepreneur. I only started my own business because I couldn't find the perfect job that worked with my life. And that was 20 years ago. And I know that when people move to a bigger company or a smaller company, or that must be the same kind of shock. Or when a company gets taken over, been through that as well. Am I right?
Absolutely. Culture in many ways is the way we do things, right? So it's our norms, the values, like how things are done, what's rewarded, what's not rewarded. And it's interesting because there, in many ways, a lot of people say, well, you can't really see culture. But the thing is, it's just you're not looking at it with the right lens. So if you think about organizational culture, right, there's always these hidden messages that really come out, right? If you are looking for it, like who has control, who has to say, what's dominant, what are the values, how do we really get things done? And that is how culture really comes through and organizationally. And it could be really simple or really complex depending on how we look at it.
Well, you have a very intelligent way of looking at it, very thoughtful, which is why you've been invited onto the show. So tell us about something exciting that you've been working on.
Well, I am actually finishing up a book right now, and it is called Exceptional Futures, The Power of Identity to Design Positive Change. And so in it, really, I've always been fascinated and really passionate about what culture is about. Right? What is our cultural identity? Right? And there's so many factors that play into that. But then if we measure it against the lens of change, like something that you want to be doing different in your life, that forces us to revert back to a lot of the, what we know to be change. Like, what is it, is change something that's safe, or is it dangerous? Is it, is it something that we've always been encouraged to do or discouraged? Right? So where do all these like societal influences and societal expectations and cultural expectations come into play when it comes to change? So that's one of the things that the book addresses, and it helps us to raise our own awareness about how we view this and how all these expectations come into play, and then helps us to deliver and design a plan of action to be able to make that positive change there.
Well, there was a reason why we were put together, I'm sure. It was my one and only so far TEDx talk is all about change. And sometimes you need to change yourself to be yourself. And it's about identity as well. So for any listeners who haven't yet seen the TED Talk or heard it, if you're just listening, please seek that out. Sometimes you need to change yourself to be yourself. We're heading for 1 million views. So just got to promote things where you can. So thanks for mentioning the book. That's really great. So what is an area where you personally, Victoria, have had to become more thoughtful?
That's a great question. I'll answer it in this perspective. I had to slow things down and become a little bit more thoughtful because I felt like I spent the first half of my life really trying to conform, right? So I came from a society where I've always been the perpetual outsider, right? And so I spent a lot of time and energy trying to fit in some way or another. Right. And I felt like it was using up a lot of time, the energy. And even when I was leading teams, it was something that I was always like, well, how do we fit into the system? Right. But one of the things that I realized as I became a little bit more thoughtful and slowed the process down and realized that, we're in the 21st century right now. Right. And many industries and many companies are trying to move from being what we call kind of like a knowledge-based workforce to an innovation-based workforce. Right. And so being different, being unique, having a different perspective is something that should be celebrated. Right. And so what I do a lot is, not only did I have to work on myself, but also work with a lot of leaders now to help them really understand like how their unique perspective is a competitive advantage in the whole process.
Yeah, absolutely right. And still they need to hit the bottom line and double and triple bottom line and, keep all the stakeholders happy. I'm just thinking in a pressurized environment, it's very easy to go back to the norm, like you were saying, and just do the firefighting and do it the way you've always done it. And I imagine you see that all the time, right?
I do. And in many ways, it's more than that. It's like, I love how you use the word pressurized environment, right? Because in many cases, it's on a quarter by quarter basis. And you feel, and when somebody is under pressure, they revert back to what they know. Right. And they forget about the fact that you're influenced by so many different, areas in your life. Right. So, and think about like the systems in which you have been influenced. Right. So if you think about the education system, right, your community, the government, society, and everything like that, there are certain intrinsic motivators that we've internalized over the years. And so being able to understand what they are, right, and see, all right, is that really going to be serving myself and my team throughout this process? Do I need to be reactive, or do I need to be thoughtful and responsive, right, in moving this team forward? Right. So I think that is the big differentiator between like a reactionary leader, right, and a thoughtful leader in this whole process.
Well, good. You fit right into our lineup. So it was interesting while you were talking, I was thinking, oh, but there's pressure everywhere. And, there are people who will say that, like every moment of every day, they feel the pressure. And, that's not accurate. And it's also not helpful. And if that is the case, maybe they need to look at, listeners, I'm talking to you now. Maybe you need to look at where you are, what you're doing, the culture you're in, that you might need to make a change, a big change, because I really don't feel that's sustainable, that living constantly under pressure and stress. And at some point, you snap or you burn out or something like that. And then you're forced to be thoughtful, right?
Exactly. And I would say, and I see this in North America a lot, and I actually have seen this in other cultures as well, where there is this ever increasing demand and to be authentic, right? They say, well, you need to show up as an authentic leader because that's what, we have people showing up to be. And so that puts another layer of pressure, right? Because then I think for some folks, like you've lost yourself in the process so much that it makes sense to take a step back and say, have that pause in a sense to realize, all right, well, what does it mean to show up authentically? Right. And how do I do this without completely burning myself out? Because the lines between the professional and the personal have completely blurred, especially with the pandemic.
Yeah, you're right about that. I'm just thinking, I'm going back to the culture because I'm always trying to build on previous episodes. And we've had a lot of people talking about the team and about being authentic and being thoughtful. But in terms of a culture that is shifting, and let's face it, there are a lot. There are many companies going through mergers or acquisitions, downsizing, changing, from in person to more hybrid, so there is a lot of change happening in company cultures. What would be your best advice to the listeners or anybody leading themselves and a team? And if possible, can you weave it into what you were saying about, is this serving me and the team?
Yeah. It's interesting when you're talking about M&A work, or if you're talking about when like you have a reorg and you have multiple teams coming together, that it's really interesting because back to what you're saying, there's a lot of pressure to perform. Right. And I would say in many cases, a lot of companies don't take the necessary steps to integrate. Right. And to actually figure out, all right, well, now we're bringing these two entities together. How do we make sure that we're creating something, new and vibrant, and that is going to like help everybody feel like that they're part of something? So when you think about group identity or social identity in general, it's a high motivator for people to understand like what is the purpose, right? What am I doing here? I'm giving my time and my talent, and so being able to set that vision for organizations, and also to think about what the norms and the expectations are, and also make sure that it's something that's collectively done. It doesn't take a ton of time, but it is essential for you to be able to move forward. But I've always been surprised as I go in and I work with executives on how little that's done. Right. Because it's real, they'll say, well, we need to start from day one. Here's our here's our North Star, and this is what we're going to be doing. But they don't really think about like, all right, who's buying into this? Right. Is this something that people are really going to be willing to get behind? Right. And so sometimes that takes a little bit of vulnerability and to be able to work across all levels within the organization to be able to get that feedback.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for bringing that up. One of our favorite words here at The Thoughtful Leader is awareness, and that includes self-awareness and awareness of your environment and all other kinds of awareness. I'm thinking that is probably the first step. And when you said about what are the expectations, and if people have never thought about it, I'm guessing that they're not even aware. They couldn't easily define the culture in words. Would I be right?
Absolutely. One of the things I like to do when I sit down with executives is actually map out like a coaching engagement in terms of 3 phases: awareness, alignment, and action. Right. And so always been surprised at organizations that go straight to action without the awareness and alignment bit. So yes, awareness is fundamental. It's not even like important. It's fundamental to making any change happen. So I completely agree with what you're saying here.
And not to say but, and if there's a lot of pressure, going back to that, the culture of a fast-paced merger or shareholders breathing down your back or the C-suite or whatever the issues are, the realities, I should say, it's sometimes easier to think about jumping straight in and, all of that, stepping back, being thoughtful, gaining some awareness, making your observations. That seems like a nice to have. So what would your advice be to any of our listeners thinking, yeah, this is all very nice, but there's, pressure?
Absolutely. One of the things I noticed that's that has huge cultural implications is the notion of time. Right. And again, if you're thinking on a week by week or quarterly basis, right, you're going to be reactive at all times. And you're going to feel like your leadership doesn't have much control of that. So one of the things I like to sit down and talk to leaders about is courage, right? Is sometimes you do, it's a part of what people appreciate in a leader is the ability to protect their people and to be able to see the vision and to provide a path forward. Right? And so sometimes that requires slowing it down and then also being able to be able to explain courageously to all the stakeholders that are involved. It could be your board of directors. It could be it could be the shareholders, and saying, all right, here's where we are right now. And here's where we need to go. Right. It's going to take a little bit of time, but we're building for the future. Right. So and I would say that there's definitely that tension that's being within the short term versus the midterm versus the long term. But I'm finding that it's for the individuals who can really think holistically toward the long term, people feel safer within their organization. People feel like they want to sign on and feel like that they're working towards something better.
Okay, so let's do a little role play. I've never done this on the show before, but I'm sure you're up to it. Victoria, please let me know what you would say if I were this executive and all I keep talking about is the quarterly and the annual report and the pretty short-term thinking. How would you sell to me this idea about thinking more long-term?
Okay, so there's a few things that are at play. Right. So I have a number of questions, right? So understanding like, all right, so what's important to you? What's important to the organization? How do we, what would it look like for the organization to still be around in 10 years, in 50 years? What are the actions that you would need to take in order to get that? What's important about that in terms of, building systemic processes to make sure that happens, right? That you will be, that the company will be around in 10 years, in 50 years, in 100 years, so I do think that there are a certain subset of executives who really believe in that. And they're trying to build not something, they're not just trying to build a company that makes money. They're trying to build something bigger than themselves. Right. And what I understand, I think for a lot of executives, it's also about, making their imprint, fulfilling their legacy as leaders. And so, I get really curious, ask a lot of questions around that. And they, usually I get a pretty good understanding fairly quickly as to what's important to them, if it is the short term or the long term. And then we have to adapt the coaching based on that. Have you read The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek? Yes, I have. It's reminding me of that book, which I really liked. Listeners, do check it out if you like this conversation so far. We have a few minutes left, so I want to pick up on what you said. You said, if it's important to them. What I was hoping to do was provoke you into selling me on the fact that it is important. So, round 2. Yes, it is important. And this is where my idealism comes in. right? It's like, and of course, I do look at, well, what do we want to make sure that, how are you making an impact within the industry, within the greater ecosystem? How do you want to make sure that you are leaving a positive impact, imprint in the world? Right. Sometimes when you're thinking short term, you're not thinking positively. You're actually thinking like you just want to, I just need to make whatever I need to make in order to get through this next quarter. Right. Is that really what's best? And is that sustainable? And so I think sustainability is the big question that I always have is like, all right, so in terms of your leadership, not only just your style, your vision, everything like that, what does sustainability mean to you? Right. And it's really fascinating to see how people respond to that. Right. Because sometimes it is something that comes down to fundamentally like, I actually want to make sure that I am making the best positive impact on not only myself, but I also want to leave again, idealistically leave the world in a better place, for the generations to come.
Yes. 日本語話せますか?
はい、話せます。
Let's not freak people out here. I've been preparing for my Japan trip, and I've studied Japanese for the first time 35 years ago, and I've picked it up again recently. And another plug, they are not sponsors of this podcast yet, but Duolingo, amazing. It's addictive as well. The reason I ask is it sounds like a Japanese or Far East kind of culture. And certainly when I was reading The Infinite Game, there were references to the 50 and 100-year plan. So nobody's really thinking about their individual legacy in that case. Am I right?
Yes and no. It is a blend, right? It's like, because we have the opportunity as leaders to impact the system as much as the system has the opportunity to impact us. And since we're getting into, I would say philosophy here. I mean, I also believe in the concept of ikigai, right? That the greater purpose that you serve. Right. And so it's fascinating to see, like, sometimes when I work with leaders, especially in transition, one of the questions that I do ask them is, we do talk about purpose and we talk about philosophy and everything like that. But we also get down to like, all right, so what is it about this role, right, that's going to help serve that greater purpose for you, your ikigai, right, in a sense. And it's fascinating because some people are just like, I've never had to think about this. I've always just kind of moved from one thing to another. So they're living in the moment, right? And so helping to stretch that out and helping to sort of like, all right, who are you? And what is your purpose here? And how does this role help you to make that the best possible impact as you can? And you're right. It is very much, and I think that it could be rooted in my cultural identity and where I came from. And I, just as an aside, through my doctoral program, I actually went over to Singapore and we actually studied the education system there. And one of the things that I was really most impressed with is that every layer of government there has a 50-year plan. So, what other entities actually think about that length of time? Right. But the fact that they're very aware of like what needs to happen over the next 50 years and how to adapt in a rapidly changing world for the next 50 years is something that was highly impressive for me.
Well, I think that just nails it. That is why you bring this very unique gift, and you're uniquely positioned to talk about this and to help bridge those two things. There's very much a long-term view and value in having that, having the clarity, and the individual within the ecosystem feeling valued. And maybe that is going to be a constant tension. It's a source of fascination for me anyway. I know you and I will be having more conversations in English and or Japanese, whatever you like. But for now, yeah, we'll have to say sayonara for now. But listeners, there's a lot more of this. If you're interested, please do check out Victoria's bio, and the show notes are all there for you. You can listen to the episode again if you want, if you haven't been taking notes, maybe you've been driving. So it just remains for me to say, domo arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you.
こちらこそ。
I didn't think I'd be speaking Japanese on this episode, but you just never know what you're going to get with the Thoughtful Leader podcast. So thank you again for coming on the show, Victoria Wilson.
Thank you very much.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Thoughtful Leader, and I hope it's inspired you to be more thoughtful as a leader in your business. Please consider subscribing and leaving a review. An important question for you. Do you want to create a culture of thought leadership in your organization? My best-selling book, The Thoughtful Leader, is available now on Amazon and many other sites in paperback, ebook, and audiobook formats. Please visit www.mindygk.com for more great content. That's www.mindygk.com. Speak to you again soon.